Recently, a few weeks back, Facebook released the newer version of React with a lot of exciting features. We will be discussing about all those features in today's episode. Myself, Vishnu VG. I am a .NET developer from Thiruvananthapuram. I work with the .NET and cloud technologies. My podcast is available on all podcast platforms like the Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon and others. So you can listen from any of your favorite podcast apps as you like. In addition to that, I am an AWS community builder. I hold regular meetup talks in the meetup group Coding Talks Cloud Computing, which is available on Meetup. So if you are interested, you can check out that Meetup group and subscribe to that group so that you will receive updates on for later events and all. Usually I conduct events mostly on weekends whenever I get time. All the past Meetup recordings are available on my YouTube channel, Coding Talks with Vishnu VG. So if you are interested, feel free to have a look at those. With that, we can start discussing on the new version of React.js, that is 18. Before looking into the latest version, I would like to spend some time talking about a quick overview about what React is all about. Just a quick introduction of the different parts of React application, and then we will dive deep into the specific features that are available in the version 18. Many of you already know, but maybe this is a bit repetitive, but still for those who are new, this will be helpful. So that's why I explaining. React.js is a free and open source front-end JavaScript library that is available from Facebook for you to download, and you can build interactive user interfaces. This library is based on the principles of UI components. This library was formerly used internally inside Facebook, and when they found this library quite useful and scalable according to the massive user requirements of Facebook, they considered this as a success, and later they made it generally available. When they made it generally available during the year 2013, it became a massive success, and many developers and organizations quickly adopted this library. With the feedback from the developers and other organizations that began to use this library, many of them started adopting this library into their daily development stack. They built complex UIs and interactive UIs using the React library, and later a different version evolved. So the initial release happened during the year 2013, and by the time of this recording, that is April 13th, 2022, the updated React version is 18. That is the topic of today's discussion. Why we go for a library like React is worth understanding. Traditionally, back in old days of web development, developers used a kind of a monolithic approach for developing web application. They consider and develop the entire web page or a set of pages as one single component. This was fine during that days, but it has its inherent limitations as well, especially when we are making a change or when we want to maintain a larger website. This approach is not that much feasible. Also, this approach also makes the functionality of a web page very difficult to isolate and very difficult to understand. So a new developer would feel much difficult to understand what's going behind the scene, and moreover it limits reusability, because we are considering only a single page as a entity. Then we don't have the option to further break it down and reuse that in other part of the application. Then later when the development evolved, many other forms of architecture evolved, like the concept of shared libraries, then the concept of MVC and all evolved. But what the Facebook says in their blog when they come up with this new approach of the component kind of architecture, what they mentioned is like, even though there were existing architecture patterns during that time, like the MVC and all, still that didn't quite scaled efficiently according to the massive users of Facebook. So they considered MVC kind of an architecture as an utter failure, and they reinvented. They kind of not reinvented, they adopted a different kind of strategy called the component-based strategy, where Facebook feels that the data that is data, the associated logic and presentation that are all related to a specific functionality should remain at one place. So thus they came up with the idea of components. So in component mode of architecture, according to React, a web page will be composed of smaller modular parts called components, and the role of a React developer is to create different reusable components and then assemble that into make a final web page according to the requirements of the users. Facebook adopted this strategy. So if you look at a Facebook page, their comments, their chat section is on component, and even inside the chat sections, they further divide reusable parts into multiple more modular smaller components. So that is the concept of component. So the benefit of component is that it can reuse. Second thing is like it is not complex as an MVC architecture. If you look into an MVC architecture, you need to figure out where the data comes from. Maybe that exists in a separate file, and then there will be a template file for binding the data and all. Then this way different separation of concerns there. According to React, this separations of concern doesn't quite work well, especially when it comes to maintaining the application, and it will be troublesome when updating a part of an application. We need to change, according to Facebook, we need to change 3 different files for making a single change. So the Facebook suggests that everything related to a specific functionality should remain in a single place, and thus the idea of components came with React. Maybe it exists in different other parts, but more popular with React, and then other frameworks like Angular, and also the recent frameworks based on C# by Microsoft, which is the Blazor.net, that also adopted that same kind of strategy called the components. From an initial look also, we can understand that the more modular functionality we can focus on, the better we can develop an application. Furthermore, if you look at a component, we can read the component from top to bottom and can understand how it's working. In the actual real life scenario, things work in a different manner, because when a project involved, there will be a lot of components. We need to figure out how different components work together. We need to go through one by one from the app, from the index page to the then the app page, which is firing up all the other components and all. But still, if we get an idea like, okay, this component has a particular problem, the advantage is like just by reading that component, we can understand how its functionality is going on. So that is the advantage what Facebook team is mentioning when they introduced the concept of components in React. So they entirely revamped the MVC architecture and moved into a different kind of strategy like component. So now let's look at what a component looks like. The majority part of a React developer is to identify what components they should make and then assemble that to form the web page. So component development is very critical or very important part in React application development. If you are interested in learning about React, you should be familiar with how to create a component. So this can be understood in different ways, especially if you are new. You can simply create a new React application using the Visual Studio latest version. Visual Studio is an editor from Microsoft, and for the learning and training purpose you can use the community version of Visual Studio, which is what we all .NET developers use to try out in our home. That is free and recommended to use for our personal use. And then once we install the latest version of Visual Studio, as of the time of this recording, it is Visual Studio 2022. So if you install that, then you can easily create a new web project, new ASP.NET Core project using the React template. So Visual Studio will create you a default React application with 1 or 2 sample components. So if you look into that component folder, you can understand how a component is working, even though it's a sample application. So that component's top portion will have the data logic for pulling the data. Imagine if you are developing a React web application for a blog website. So usually a blog website will have different section, and the one important main section of the blog is the comment section, which resides below the post. So that comment can be treated as a individual component. So imagine if you are looking into a comment component, at the top section of the comment component there will be a section which is written in JavaScript for loading the data, which can be usually from a database or from an external API or whatever way. Even you can hardcode the data, it works fine. So that way you will load the data and store that data in a variable, and storing that data in a variable is what we call the state inside a component. So the data, we understood the data, we load the data and we store that inside a variable, and then we will do some massaging to that data. Massaging means some transformation to the data to the way we want to present the data to the actual user. Maybe if it's a kind of a form, if it's a case of a currency or something, we will add some format or something, and then finally we want to present the data. So on the last bottom section of the component, usually in most of the components there will be a syntax similar to HTML combined with the JavaScript. So that is called the JSX syntax. So that is very easy to understand. It's simple to understand, like it's like a pure HTML combined with a JavaScript. So you can, if you want to embed some JavaScript code inside that HTML, you can use a open bracket and then use a variable there. So in this common component, we understood we are loading the data to a variable. We store that variable to a state inside the component. Then state means that is also just a variable. It has a syntax called set state and all. If you look into a component, you can understand. And then we will use that data to present the data or show to the user inside that HTML. So that syntax is called the JSX, where HTML and JavaScript is combined and used quite jointly. So the reason for this adoption is React theme fields. This is the way developers should focus, and they can quite develop very effectively if they can find the JavaScript or the actual coding logic and the HTML to be reside together inside a components. And personally, I feel they are right. Like sometimes when I develop the React component, it's very easy because I can just go inside a single component and can make changes there without looking into multiple files and making modifications to multiple files. So this is how a component looks like. There are some advanced concepts you need to know, like either we can store the retrieved data state inside a component, or we can store it outside the component. That's all we need to understand as a React developer. But for the understanding of this episode, you may not need to familiar with all those. Just a quick understanding of what a component is enough for you to get started. So with that, we can look into the other part of the this episode, or the main part of the episode, where we are thinking about understanding what's the new feature with the React version 18. So we have understood that we have a component, we have its data loading mechanism, we have its data presentation, and we have its state as well. So when we combine all this, it works quite well for a simple application. But when the application evolves, complexities increase. Just in the case of this comment example which we discussed, we are retrieving a data from an external API. Maybe that will take some time if there involves a lot of comments from external parties. So at that time, what we should show to the user is what we need to think about. So we can either show a spinner or something, or some simple text like data is loading or something. So that all resides inside that comment component. Then when we add this data loading logic and all, like the data loading, like this data is loading, or the spinner is running, all these different kinds of data loading activities other than the data. So our main focus of component development is to retrieve the data and present to the user, but some additional complexities do happen naturally, like how to let the user that okay, data is pulling from there, and we want to show the that we want to inform them that let's wait for some more time till the data is loading. So that all things when we introduce, it's actually adding unnecessary burden to the developers. So the problem here is two different concerns are what the developer is handling here. One is reading the data. Second one is how to specify the user that we are loading the data, and how we want to show the spinner and all. So naturally, if you look into most of the real world React projects, you would see something like in addition to data loading, some other variables also exist along with that, like the is loading, to indicate that the is loading is a kind of a boolean which indicates that the data is loading from external party. So once the data has been successfully loaded from the API, the boolean will be set to is loaded, set to true or something, otherwise it will be false. So based on that switch mechanism, we will show the spinner to the user. So that complexities do exist when it comes to a real world application. So this was existing from the time of React when they initially launched, but as React become more popular, more external data loading libraries came out, like the Apollo, Use SWR, or React Query, which handle most of these data loading logic into their libraries, and we can just reuse them. Those libraries are available from NPM. So NPM, we can install the reusable libraries which are created by other developers, and we can reuse that in our application. So by relying to or by outsourcing these data loading and its associated data loaded, or whether data is currently loading, or those all logic to an external library like Apollo, or used SWR, or Axios, or React Query, we can much simplify the component. So we can just use the library, and we can simply store that output from the library to a variable, like the data. Maybe we have two different variables, like the data and then the is loading. So two different things are there. So that way we can simplify the component, but still there exists a problem. Like if we are making a bit complex component, then handling this data and the additional mechanism, like how the data loading is showing. So these two concerns will always be a problem, especially when we add things. It makes the component more complex. So to avoid that, or to ease the development, in the newest version of React, the Facebook team had come up with a new version, or the React team had come up with a new feature which is called the suspense. So what they referred is, we can simply use the suspense feature. So that's an element which can be wrapped inside your parent component. So that element will have a prop, and you can supply the prop. That prop is a fallback prop, and you can supply that to the that element of functionality, and or that or we can call that as a component itself, and then we can simply use that in our application. So all the other things you can remove, like the variable for storing the ease loading and all things, you can simply remove, and you can simply use the suspense inside your application. So similar equally similar methods were exist before there, but with the version of 18, this suspense mode is also available for the server component as well. So server component is another one concept which is still evolving, and which is still not finalized in the React, in the native React ecosystem. Some external parties are providing the server component rendering mechanisms, but for the React it is still under development. So why for this suspense fallback they introduced, this will work quite well with the server component as well. So this concept, this suspense and all, is part of the new behind the scene evolution mechanism that is introduced with the React 18. So they were already learning different kinds of devices. Like when React started, it started for creating applications for the website. But as it evolved, then the mobile devices become popularly adopted, and then the React Native also came into existence. So they have learned the different devices, like the React team has learned different devices, like how a web application is working inside a browser, how it is working, how that same application is working as a React Native application inside a mobile device like the iOS or Android. So when they found out the differences, they understood, like inside a web page, inside a machine, it's working as a single threaded, while in a mobile application it is working as a multi-threaded. So they feel that adopting this concurrent mode is quite good for the future versions of React. So that is why they were experimenting this for quite a long time, and part of that they have introduced this into the React 18. So if you migrate your existing applications to React 18, you can use the concurrency feature, or concurrent mode is natively there in the React 18. It is up to you to use the concurrent mode features or not. Your existing applications will still work as it is, but concurrency greatly improves the it's not a feature, it's a kind of a behind the scene mechanism that enables React to prepare multiple versions of your user interface components at the same time. So it's kind of an implementation detail, and it's a valuable implementation detail as well because of the features that it unlocks. So behind the scene, internally, React uses sophisticated techniques in its internal implementation, example like the priority queues and multiple buffering. But from an outside perspective, you may not be aware of all things, but migrating to React 18 is a major forward thing. You are getting more features, and in the future versions of React they will be introducing new features based on this concurrent mode. So this suspense mode is also part of concurrent mode, where it is available on the server side as well. So they were, like I said earlier, they were evolving during the part. React was evolving from the 2013, the time where when the React was introduced, and during the past years the team were experimenting with multiple devices like the mobile, web. They have integrated a lot of learning and also the design, and that way they feel that the developer and designer should work. Sometimes a designer will think the web application to be in a particular form, and then that is communicated to the developer to finally transform the design to a working application. But because of the limitations that exist with the developer, they may not able to completely transfer that to the way by how designers want. So React, when they developed the React library, they focused much on the designer mode of way, and that way, based on the design principles, they created the this library. So that means that a developer can easily adopt the designer how they want. So this is the introduction. This leads to the evolution of this concurrent mode and all the other features. So with this release which we are discussing, with the version 18, a set of concurrent features has been added, which I said before, it's optional. But if you enable that concurrent features, it will greatly enrich your application. But still your existing application will work without any existing change, even if you migrate to React 18. Using this this kind of concurrent features is up to you. But as you evolve, as the application is updating, then you can add more concurrent features to improve the application. So suspense mode, as we discussed, like the loading of data, where you can simply ignore all the data loading mechanisms, like the ease loading mechanism, how you want to present the data, and all. You can ignore that totally, and you can make your component much leaner using this suspense mode. And the other thing is, like this suspense mode works quite well with the server components as well. About the server components we can discuss a bit later, but before that the key point here in this introduction of the suspense like features is, firstly, it makes the component much leaner. Second one is, like we can add new functionality to the component without much changes, because the logic will be much simpler. Example, if you have a list of data you want to present, and if you want to add a loader, you can wrap that list inside a suspense component, and you can provide a fallback to let the spinner know that what UI should be loaded or what text should be shown instead of the during the loading time. All the other things behind the scene will be handled automatically. You don't need to provide any variable or anything. All other things will be handled automatically by the React. The only thing which you need to aware of is, like, this is currently in experimental mode, and by the time of the release of version 18 of React, some of the common libraries like the React Query, the SWR, Apollo, these are all supported with the suspense, but other libraries may not have that much support. So in the coming days, React is saying that they will add support to all the major common libraries out there. Second thing is, like if you are showing a spinner for a list, and if you want to add some more functionality inside that list which will have another set of spinners, you can have that as well. So that means you can nest multiple suspense inside on another, and this suspense is working based on the concept of that concurrent mode. So that means that each part of the application, each component will work independently without blocking any of the thread. That means better performance. Earlier also we can load the data and then we can show to a component and it will render, but with the introduction of 18, with the introduction of the concurrency mode, the suspense or the component rendering will work in a more better way. Definitely going forward to the version 18 will be a helpful addition for you as a developer. Second thing I mentioned here is lots of client components. So everything related to what we want to present data to the user and all, we develop as a component, and that will be rendered by the browser using a JavaScript, and React will take care of the things. So that's the way by which we usually think of. But imagine Netflix is one example where I once watched a session which presented this concept of server components and client components using the example of Netflix. So if you open the Netflix page, you can see that initially when that page will gets open, and you can see there is a portion of Netflix where the video is streamed from the server. So that video streaming part is handled from the server side, and in such scenarios you can use the server components combined with the client components to make the loading in a much effective fashion. So there are different approaches which you can adopt, like if you have a website with a lot of components in one page, and if you feel that one component is loading data, for example a comment section where it is loading data from an external API which is taking a lot of time, then what you can do is you can either show some feedback, like using a suspense mechanism to let the user know that okay, the data is loading here, but still the other components will load without affecting any of the page functionality quite well. One approach is that approach. Another approach is like you can in this case of components where it's taking a lot of time or there is a lot of processing involved, then you can move that part to as a server component where it is rendered on the server, and the output from that server as an HTML is what transferred to the React front end. So the browser role for or the front-end React part for that component part is to just show the data HTML received from the backend that is generated from the server side. So that will be a much better approach. So with the main thing is with the suspense is now supported on server as well. So if you load the data from the server, even if it's taking some time, still you can add a loader there from the server side as well using the server's components. Keep in mind that server component is still in experimental stages and it's not fully available on React, but experiments are going on. So that means with the adoption of this concurrent mode, and also with the adoption of some of the changes in the later versions of React, maybe a server mode will be added there and you can use that. It's still experimental in React. It's not publicly, it's not ready for production, but if you're interested in using server components, you can check out the Next.js, then Hydrogen or something, such libraries exist there. So you can worth checking out that. You can just search for in Google server rendering in React and will get a lot of details about Next.js and all, which you can refer to. So that is the second feature introduced in the version 18. So first just to remind, first feature is the idea of the concurrent mode. Then the second one is like this server rendering and the support for suspense in server rendering. Then third one is the automatic batching. So to understand this automatic batching, it's worth to understand the concept of rendering inside a component. So if you look at a component in React, you are just retrieving the data from some API or some database, and then you are presenting the data. That is all what you are mentioning inside a React component. But how the component, how the data changes is reflected back to the user. So that for that React uses an internal mechanism to watch the state changes. State means the data we are retrieving from an API is stored inside a state, or it can simply think of like a variable. We can set the state of that variable, and then that state is stored inside the component. So the idea here is whenever a data inside that component changes, it automatically re-renders. So every state changes, there is a re-rendering happening inside the component. Every state changes. So this will make sometimes a problem, like imagine if there is a button and there is a event handler for that button which do a set of state changes, like a set state of name equal to let's say there is a button for clearing the different text boxes. So we are storing the data inside a text box in a state variable, and we are binding that data. It's an on-way binding. We are binding that variable to the JSX element and displaying to the user. So when we click on a clear button, naturally we want to clear all the boxes. So what we do is we will clear all the states by changing the set state to blank. So maybe we have 2 or 3 lines to clear the different states, and then what happens in all those scenarios is usually in the earlier versions, with each state changes the re-rendering happens. So that React will automatically re-render that particular component portion. So this will be inefficient because we don't need re-rendering until that full state or the series of states has been changed inside that event handler. So in that case, with the version of React 18, they come up with a better strategy called the automatic batching, where if we are setting multiple state changes inside an event handler, or it's not just for event handler, it's also applicable for async await return as well. So if you are adding async await return, and if you are adding a series of events and for event handlers or even for async await kind of methods, then automatically at the final after changing all the different states, only then the re-rendering will happen. So, and that will be more efficient than rendering on each state changes. But some scenarios you may want to still use the rendering to happen at each state changes. In that case, you can use a native syntax called, which is available with the version 18, called the flush sync, which will immediately re-render the component. But otherwise, if it identifies that if there is a series of state changes inside an event handler, then it will wait till all the state changes are applied, and then only a re-render will happen. So that will be much effective. It can avoid unnecessary re-rendering. So that's a great benefit they have added. Then another major thing React mentioned is like they are gradually adopting this concurrent features in all the future version. So this is a breaking change from the part of React, but they have tested, they have upgraded thousands of existing components to React 18, and they have found that all the existing components will work fine with the concurrent rendering without any changes. But they say that if you are migrating from a lower version, maybe some part requires some additional migration effort, but still that would be good. So let's see how we can migrate an existing application to React. So that is also worth discussing here. So if you have a prior version of application running in React 16 or 17, it's easy to upgrade to 18. So just like I mentioned here, React blog says that they have migrated thousands of applications and it's all working fine. So you can also give it a try. All the existing functionalities will work as it is, and you can also leverage some of the concurrent mode features like we discussed earlier. To upgrade, you just install the React and React DOM to the latest version, which is the 18. You may be using a 16 or 17. You can upgrade that to 18. Then you need to change the app.js or tsx file as well. So older versions may be using React DOM.render method. You need to change that to React DOM.create root. So when you plan to migrate and when you done the version upgrade of the React and React DOM, still the application would work, but you will get a warning like you need to change the React DOM.render to React DOM.create root method, which is very simpler. The full syntax of how to change that method is given in the reactjs.org/blog, where you can read and understand how that change can be done, and then everything else will work quite good as before. So that's all what you need to done, but majority of case it will be work fine is what they are mentioning. Then the server components is also an upcoming feature. They come with the combinations of this concurrent mode they will plan to integrate, but like I mentioned earlier, it's still in an initial development experimental version. So if you are interested in server components, you can check out the next.js or Hydrogen. There is also another one library called a Remix, which you can use for server components as well. Then a new feature called a transition is also introduced. It's a kind of an API as well. It's also introduced with the React 18. The transition is a kind of a new concept in React to distinguish between urgent and non-urgent updates. So urgent updates means that if you type something or clicking or pressing and so on, it's an urgent update. A transition update means that transiting a transition from one UI to another, it's called a transition update. So this is useful especially when you feel like, for example, urgent updates like typing, clicking or pressing, which you may need to for example, when you select a filter in a drop down, we are expecting that filter button to respond immediately when we click. However, the actual results may transition separately. So a small delay would be expected. So, and if you change the filter again, before the results are done rendering, you only care to see the latest results. So typically for this kind of better user experience, a single user input should result in both a urgent update and a non-urgent one, and you can use the transition API inside an input event to inform React which updates are urgent and which are transition. So transition API is there, so that way you can use. Then the other some of the other APIs or hooks that are introduced with the React version 18 is the use ID. The use ID is a new hook for generating unique IDs on both the client and the server, while avoiding the HTML hydration mismatches. So it is particularly useful for component libraries integrating with accessibility API that requires unique identities. So there was an issue that exists in React 17, and it's even more important in React 18 because of how the new streaming server renders delivers HTML out of order. So this use ID will be very helpful. Keep in mind that this use ID is not for generating keys in a list. keys should be generated from your data. So if you are aware of React components, when we are presenting a list of data, we should use a key, and this UseID cannot be used for generating key. This is especially used for generating unique IDs to avoid, especially to avoid the HTML hydration mismatches, and especially for accessibility API users. Then the use transition API, which we just discussed, that is use transition and start transition let you mark some state updates as urgent and not urgent. So once you mark a state update with use transition and start transition, it will be considered as not urgent. So by default, other state updates will be considered urgent by default. Then use deferred value is another important hook that is available with the React version 18 based on that concurrent mode. So the one second. Yeah. So the use deferred value, this hook allows you to defer the re-rendering of non-urgent part of an application. Imagine if you have a list application and the list is loading a lot of data, and you have a button called a refresh button on top. So when you click on refresh button, naturally you would expect the data to be reloaded from the server, and then the list should be updated. So you can click a few times continuously, and the data below the list will be automatically updated based on how fast your system is. But imagine if your system is a non-performant one, you can emulate that by using the Chrome debugger app, and then you can try clicking on the button. So at that time, the screen, the user interface freezes. So why this happens is, it is trying to click on the React is trying to update the click part of that button, and at the same time its underlying part called the list part is also trying to update at the same time with a with a slow machine. So what you can do is you can use the use deferred value to lets you defer re-rendering a non-urgent part of a tree. It's kind of it's similar to debouncing. There is no fixed time delay, so React will attempt the deferred render right after the first render is reflected on the screen. So if you feel that if you don't want a list to block the UI, then you can defer it value. So React will re-render that other part, and then once that is over, then this part will be rendered. So this way it will perform better on a non-performing system or on a slower system. So in this way, few other APIs or hooks also exist with the React version 18. You can check more on the reactjs.org. So those are the use insertion effect, and also the use sync external store. So that are also available there. Much more will be coming in the upcoming version. So these are all the important things I want to highlight in today's session, today's episode, and you can try out all these different things. So the main thing is the concurrent mode, then the suspense, as well as the set of other APIs like the deferred API. These are all the important things. And also the support for the server rendering, even though still it's in an experimental stage, is another important thing. So React says that as a React developer, in the future we can combine the server rendering and the client rendering together in order to provide a consistent UI experience. So some part of data can be loaded more fastly or rendered more effectively from the server, while the other part can be generated effectively from the client side. So combining these two, identifying and combining these two, would be possible in the future versions of React. This concept is same for that Blazor as well. So there is also exist a server, Blazor server, as well as a Blazor WebAssembly, where one is generated on the server, another one mostly from the client side. So these are two approaches, but here the React is trying to load some of the things which they feel which can load better from a server perspective. They can do that from server, and they can reuse that from the user UI side. Even though if we have a web page, and if there are especially on scenarios like the dashboard scenario, where we are loading a lot of data on a component, some components were able to load data quickly from the API, but while other components can have a massive amount of data and it needs to be loaded better from a server side, then we can make that part of server side, and then we can render from there. So that's the benefit of server side rendering. So these two combined will be the future, is what I understood from going through their blogs. So in addition to listening this episode, you can try out these things by using your Visual Studio, or if you don't have Visual Studio, you can try another approach as well by using the Create React App syntax. So once you install the React, then you can try out the command Create React App, and then it will create a sample application for you. Then you can look into the details of the components and all, and understand these features. If you are using the latest version, that is React 18, by default all the concurrent features will be available there, and you are optional to use that, but using that will be greatly benefit, because some of the applications which we were developed using the older versions of React, everyone know that how much extra codes we have added just to display the loader and spinner and all the data loading mechanism, and it becomes a bit cluttered after a point of time when we add a lot of functionality. So that all can be simplified with the help of that Suspense, and in addition to that, it will render the application more effectively because of the support for this concurrent mode, as well as the batching support exists there. Automatic batching supports there, which unnecessarily avoids re-rendering. So you can use all of these features. So migrating will definitely be a helpful addition. Migration, we have understood that migration is also easier. It's very simple to migrate. Just update the React version to latest version React 18, and then make the change in the app.js. Like instead of creating using the that create route, you can use that instead of using the React DOM.render, you can use the React DOM.create route method. So just change it that it's available on the blog, and that will make your application ready for the 18. So most of the time the internal implementation details and its rendering will be what you quite benefited from your application. But because the way by which this automatic batching and all happens, only it happens after the end of the event handler or the async await handlers, then you need to wait, you need to check out the different areas where you expect a break that can happen. In that areas, you can use the flush sync explicitly to force re-rendering of a state in the case of force re-rendering of a component. So with that, thank you everyone for listening this episode. I hope it give a brief overview about React as well as the newest features that are available in version 18. Thank you once again for listening, and have a great day.